If you love heart-wrenching survival stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Your support helps bring more incredible stories to life. And don't forget to drop a comment. Your thoughts and suggestions matter more than you think. The Arctic was a merciless expanse of white, stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind howled like a wild beast, tearing across the frozen wasteland, carrying with it a chill that could steal the breath from any living thing. The sun, though still visible, was a weak and distant glow behind the thick, swirling clouds. And in the middle of this frozen oblivion, something moved, small, fragile, and barely clinging to life. A lone polar bear cub. Its fur, once thick and pure white, was now matted with ice and dirt. Its tiny paws trembled as they sank into the soft snow with every sluggish step. The cub was starving. Weak. Lost. The blizzard had taken everything from it, its mother, its warmth, its last hope of survival. It let out a soft, pitiful cry, barely more than a whisper against the howling wind, but there was no one left to hear it. Miles away, Jack Harper gripped the wheel of his snowmobile, his breath fogging up his visor. He wasn't a tourist or a scientist, he was a man who had spent the last decade living in the Arctic, tracking polar bears for conservation research. He had seen the cruel fate that awaited those left alone in this unforgiving land. And today, something felt off. The radio crackled. "Jack, you there?" It was Mark, his research partner. "Yeah, I'm here," Jack responded, keeping his eyes on the white horizon. "There's a storm rolling in from the west, bad one. You need to get back before you get caught in it." Jack exhaled sharply, adjusting his thick gloves. "I know. But something's out here. I saw tracks. Small ones." Mark hesitated. "A cub?" Jack didn't answer right away. He knew the truth, an abandoned cub in the Arctic was as good as dead. And if it wasn't dead already, it soon would be. But something inside him refused to turn back. "Jack," Mark's voice was firm now. "You know what happens if you find one alone. You can't save it." Jack clenched his jaw. He knew the rules. Polar bear cubs needed their mothers for survival. Without them, they rarely made it past a few weeks. And interfering? That was dangerous, illegal even, without the right permits. But the thought of leaving a helpless creature to freeze in the dark twisted something deep inside him. He made his decision. "I have to try." The storm thickened, the wind whipping against his snowmobile as he followed the faint tracks through the snow. Every second counted. If the cub was still out here, it wouldn't last much longer. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw it. A small, shivering mass barely visible against the white landscape. Jack pulled the snowmobile to a stop and leapt off, sinking knee-deep into the snow. His heart pounded. The cub was curled into a tight ball, its breathing shallow, its tiny body barely moving. He knew enough about Arctic survival to recognize the signs. This cub was close to death. Slowly, carefully, Jack took a step closer. The cub stirred weakly, its black eyes opening just a fraction. A flicker of fear, a hint of recognition. "It's okay, little one," Jack murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm here." But then, just as he reached out, a deep, guttural growl cut through the air. Jack froze. His blood ran cold. Something was watching him. And he wasn't alone anymore. The growl was low and menacing, carried by the wind like a warning. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning the white void around him. The Arctic was vast, an endless desert of ice and snow, but at that moment, he felt trapped, like prey caught in an open field with nowhere to run. Then he saw it. A massive shadow emerging from the storm. At first, it was nothing more than a shape, a ghostly figure barely visible through the thick snowfall. But as it came closer, its form became unmistakable. A fully grown polar bear. A survivor of this brutal land. And it was staring directly at him. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed as his instincts screamed at him to back away. This was no ordinary encounter. A polar bear this close meant only one thing: he had wandered into its territory. But something was wrong. The bear wasn't charging. It wasn't acting aggressively, at least not yet. Instead, it was watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Its massive paws crushed the snow beneath it as it took slow, deliberate steps forward, its deep brown eyes flicking between Jack and the cub lying motionless on the ground. Jack's heart pounded. Was this the mother? No. It couldn't be. If it were, it would have attacked him already. A polar bear mother would never leave her cub behind, not unless something terrible had happened. Then, as if answering his unspoken question, the bear staggered. Jack's eyes widened. It was limping. That's when he saw it, dark red streaks in the snow, trailing from the bear's hind leg. A deep wound, fresh and bleeding. Jack swallowed hard. This bear was injured. And suddenly, everything made sense. The cub had been left behind because the mother was too weak to protect it. Something had happened, maybe another bear attack, maybe a desperate fight for food. Whatever it was, she had barely survived, and now she had returned. But she wasn't strong enough to care for her baby. The wind howled around them, and for a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Jack knew he had two choices. He could turn back, leave the cub and let nature take its course. That was what the laws of the wild dictated, only the strongest survived. Or he could do the unthinkable. Help a dying polar bear and its abandoned cub. Slowly, Jack raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. The bear watched him carefully, its labored breaths visible in the freezing air. "I'm not your enemy," Jack murmured. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the deafening silence of the Arctic, it carried. The bear exhaled sharply, her body swaying slightly as she fought to stay upright. She was close to collapsing. If he did nothing, she wouldn't last another day. Jack glanced down at the cub. It hadn't moved. Time was running out. His fingers tightened into fists. He had made his decision the moment he saw that tiny, helpless creature in the snow. Carefully, he reached into his pack, pulling out a thermal blanket. It wasn't much, but it could shield the cub from the worst of the cold. Then, cautiously, he crouched beside the tiny body and wrapped it gently. The cub barely stirred. It was cold, too cold. It needed warmth, food, something to keep it from slipping away completely. Jack knew he couldn't just take it with him. If he did, the mother bear might see him as a threat and attack. He had to think fast. He looked at the massive predator in front of him. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. And then, for the briefest moment, something incredible happened. Their eyes met. Jack had spent years studying polar bears, but he had never felt anything like this before. A connection. A silent understanding. She wasn't just watching him, she was trusting him. A shiver ran down Jack's spine, but it wasn't from the cold. He had just made a promise. And now, he had to figure out how to keep it. The Arctic night was closing in fast. The temperature had already plummeted below freezing, and soon, the blizzard would swallow everything in its path. Jack knew he didn't have time to hesitate. The cub was dying. The mother bear was on the brink of collapse. And if he didn't act now, he would be left with two lifeless bodies in the snow. His mind raced. He had a small cabin a few miles back, a remote research outpost barely big enough for one person, let alone a fully grown polar bear. But the cub? He could keep it warm there, at least for the night. If he left it here, it wouldn't survive until morning. Jack's breath came out in a thick cloud as he turned his attention to the mother. She was still watching him, her body swaying slightly. He knew she was weighing her options, just like he was. She had survived this long, but she was weak, wounded, and starving. In her condition, she wouldn't be able to hunt, let alone protect the cub from other predators. She needed food. Jack reached for his pack again, pulling out the only thing he had left, a ration bar. It was barely enough to sustain a human, let alone a 1,000-pound bear, but it was something. He broke it in half and carefully tossed one piece onto the snow a few feet away. The bear didn't move. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. If she took the food, it meant she wasn't completely hopeless yet. It meant she still had the will to survive. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the bear lowered her head. She sniffed the food cautiously before taking it between her powerful jaws. Jack watched as she chewed weakly, her body trembling from exhaustion. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show her that he wasn't a threat. Hope flickered in Jack's chest. Now came the hard part. He turned back to the cub, its tiny frame barely moving beneath the thermal blanket. If he wanted to save it, he had to get it to warmth, fast. But how would the mother react if he touched it? Jack knew there was only one way to find out. He moved slowly, lowering himself beside the cub. Its breathing was shallow, barely noticeable. Every instinct told him to act quickly, to scoop the fragile creature into his arms and run. But he forced himself to stay calm. To be careful. He reached out, hesitating for only a second before sliding his hands under the cub's tiny body. And then, the mother bear let out a deep, rumbling sound. Not a growl. Not a warning. Something else. A sound Jack had never heard before. A sound that felt almost accepting. Jack exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was letting him take the cub. His hands tightened around the fragile body as he lifted it gently. It barely weighed anything, too light for a cub its age. It had gone too long without food. If he didn't get it to warmth soon, even this small act of trust wouldn't matter. Jack stood carefully, keeping his eyes on the mother. "I'll bring it back," he promised, his voice barely a whisper against the roaring wind. "I swear." He didn't know if she understood. But as he turned and made his way back to the snowmobile, she didn't stop him. She just watched. And as the storm swallowed her silhouette behind him, Jack pressed forward, knowing that the real fight for survival had only just begun. The Arctic wind howled like a wounded beast, biting into Jack's exposed skin as he tightened his grip on the fragile cub wrapped in the thermal blanket. Every breath he took was sharp and shallow, the freezing air burning his lungs. His snowmobile was just ahead, half buried in the accumulating snow. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The mother bear was still out there, lost in the white abyss, watching him disappear into the storm. Jack had made her a promise. He didn't know if she understood his words, but he hoped she understood his intent. Because now, the cub's survival was in his hands. With careful precision, he climbed onto the snowmobile, cradling the tiny creature close to his chest. Its body was ice cold, its breaths weak and uneven. He didn't have much time. The engine roared to life, a defiant sound against the merciless Arctic night. Jack leaned forward, twisting the throttle. The machine lurched forward, tires spinning against the snow-packed ground before gaining traction. He pushed it to the limit. The outpost was nearly 3 miles away, an eternity in a storm like this. Snow whipped against his goggles, reducing his vision to mere feet ahead. The headlights cast an eerie glow on the endless white, but he barely paid attention. His focus was on the cub, on its slow, fragile breaths against his chest. "Stay with me, little one," he muttered under his breath, as if his words could anchor it to life. The wind shrieked, trying to push him off course. His knuckles turned white on the handlebars. And then, darkness ahead. Jack barely had time to react before the snowmobile hit something, a hidden ridge beneath the ice. The impact jolted him forward, the machine skidding wildly before he wrestled it back under control. The cub let out a weak whimper, barely audible over the storm. His heart pounded. He was running out of time. The cabin, a flickering hope. At last, through the thick veil of snow, the faint outline of his outpost emerged. Relief surged through him. He could already see the dim glow of the emergency lantern inside, barely visible through the frost-covered windows. He pulled the snowmobile to a sharp stop, cutting the engine. Without wasting a second, he swung his leg over the seat and rushed toward the door, shielding the cub from the wind as best as he could. His hands trembled from the cold as he fumbled with the key, his fingers numb and uncooperative. The lock clicked, and he shoved the door open, stepping into the dim, suffocating warmth of the cabin. The air inside was stale but mercifully heated. Jack kicked the door shut with his boot, immediately moving toward the small cot against the wall. He gently laid the cub down, unwrapping the blanket enough to examine it under the weak glow of the lantern. The tiny creature barely stirred. Its fur was damp with melting snow, its body unnaturally cold. Jack pressed his fingers against its small chest, searching for the rhythmic rise and fall of its breath. It was there, but faint. Too faint. He needed to act fast. A fight against the cold. Jack grabbed a thick, dry towel from a shelf and began rubbing the cub's fur, trying to generate warmth. He moved carefully but firmly, his hands working as fast as possible without hurting the fragile creature. "Come on," he murmured. "You're not giving up now." He reached for his thermos, pouring a small amount of lukewarm water into a cap. He dipped his fingers in, then brought them to the cub's mouth, letting tiny drops of water touch its lips. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker of movement. The cub's tongue barely flicked out, tasting the water. Jack's breath hitched. It wasn't much, but it was something. Encouraged, he repeated the process, his heart hammering as the cub weakly responded. The warmth in the room, the towel, the water, it was working. But it wasn't enough. This cub needed its mother. And out there, somewhere in the endless white, she was dying. Jack sat back, exhaling sharply. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his mind racing. The cub had a chance now, but it wouldn't last long without its mother's milk. The brutal truth was simple, without her, it would die within days. He had only bought it time. Jack's jaw clenched. He hadn't come all this way just to let nature take its course. He stood abruptly, grabbing his emergency pack. His body was exhausted, his limbs aching from the cold, but he ignored it. Because he wasn't done yet. He had to go back. Back into the storm. Back to the mother bear. And this time, he wasn't coming back alone. The storm outside was a living thing, a furious, howling beast that tore at the world with teeth made of ice and wind. Jack stood in the cabin, watching through the frost-covered windows, his chest tight with the weight of the decision that loomed over him. The cub was safe, for now. Warm. Federal. Its tiny body had responded to the water, its breathing more regular than before. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. Without its mother, the cub's survival was a delicate thread. He'd bought it time, but time was running out. Jack had to go back. His boots crunched on the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. He hesitated, looking down at the cub for one last time. It had fallen into a shallow sleep, its tiny chest rising and falling gently beneath the blanket. "Stay safe," he whispered, knowing the cub couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. He understood. With a deep breath, Jack stepped outside. The cold hit him like a punch to the face, biting through his layers of clothing. The snow had piled up since he'd arrived, making the ground uneven and treacherous. He tugged his hood tighter, pulling his scarf around his face to protect against the sharp wind. The snowmobile was still parked by the cabin, its engine quiet in the stillness of the night. Jack climbed on and, with a firm grip, fired it up again. The machine roared to life, cutting through the silence like a warrior preparing for battle. He knew where the mother bear was. He had seen the faint outline of her form through the blizzard earlier, and now, as the storm intensified, he could only pray that she was still there, still alive. The ride back into the storm was brutal. The visibility was almost non-existent, the snowflakes sharp and stinging as they lashed against his face. He forced himself to focus, his hands gripping the handlebars with determination. There was no turning back now. After what felt like an eternity, Jack saw it, the dark shape ahead. The mother. She was still there, still standing. But she was barely moving. Her massive form was hunched low, and Jack could see that she was trembling, an animal pushed to its limits. Her wound had clearly taken its toll. She had no strength left to hunt, to fight, to survive alone. And now, she was alone in the harshest place on earth. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. He brought the snowmobile to a slow stop, his boots crunching through the deep snow as he approached the bear. At first, the mother didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide and unblinking. For a moment, Jack thought she might be too weak to even stand. But then, she stirred. The bear took a tentative step forward, then another. Her breathing was labored, ragged. Jack could see the blood-stained snow beneath her paws. She was injured, but there was still a fire in her eyes. She wasn't ready to give up. "Easy now," Jack whispered, stepping cautiously closer. He didn't want to spook her. He didn't want to make her feel threatened. His eyes darted to the wound on her leg, still bleeding. She had been through hell, and now, here she was, facing him with a look that spoke of exhaustion, pain, and the faintest trace of hope. Jack knew what he had to do. With steady hands, he reached into his pack and pulled out a fresh ration bar. The same kind he'd given her earlier, just a small bit of food to keep her going. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to help her through the night. He placed it on the ground in front of her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The mother sniffed the air, her massive nostrils flaring as she took in the scent. Her gaze flickered between the food and Jack, and for a long, heart-stopping moment, she didn't move. But then, slowly, cautiously, she lowered her head. Her jaws closed around the bar with surprising gentleness, and she chewed it down, her eyes still fixed on Jack. She was too weak to fight, too weak to take her cub back. But Jack knew that this was the moment. This was the beginning of something new. He stepped forward. "I'm not here to take your cub," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm here to help." And as if understanding his words, the bear's eyes softened. She let out a low, almost mournful sound, a sound that, for the first time, didn't hold any aggression. Jack took another step, moving closer. He could see the pain in her eyes, the desperation. But she wasn't fighting anymore. She was trusting him. The bond was forming. But it wasn't enough. Jack knelt beside her, placing a hand on her massive, trembling shoulder. His mind raced, calculating what to do next. The wound needed to be treated. She needed rest. But above all, she needed the strength to take her cub back. He wasn't leaving without them. As the snowstorm raged around them, Jack made a silent vow. He would see this through. He would save both the cub and its mother, no matter the cost. Because in the Arctic, survival was never guaranteed. It was a battle. A fight against the elements, against the odds, against the very forces of nature. But Jack had already proven he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not while there was hope. The hours passed like minutes, the storm never letting up, as Jack stayed by the mother bear's side. He had managed to treat her wound the best he could with the limited supplies from his emergency kit. The bleeding had slowed, but the damage was still severe. Her massive frame shook with exhaustion, but she no longer seemed as desperate, as panicked. There was a sense of calm in her eyes now, a fragile trust that had formed between them in the midst of the chaos. Jack's heart swelled with both relief and sadness. He knew the journey ahead would be long and perilous for both of them. The cub, back in the cabin, was still resting, its tiny body beginning to regain warmth. Jack had hoped the mother would rally enough to make the trek back with him, but deep down, he knew the truth. She couldn't move far. Not yet. The storm howled on, relentlessly. Jack's body ached, frozen from the cold that seemed to seep into his bones no matter how many layers of clothing he wore. The sound of the wind was deafening, drowning out all other noise. Yet, in the midst of that violent, unyielding wind, something incredible happened. The mother bear, whose strength had seemed depleted just hours ago, lifted her head slowly, as if sensing something. Her ears twitched, her nostrils flared. For the first time in hours, she rose to her feet, shaky but determined. She looked at Jack, then at the path ahead, her body still stiff with pain. Her steps were slow, but they were steady. She was moving. Jack could hardly believe his eyes. Are you sure about this?" he whispered to her, his voice filled with awe. He didn't expect her to answer, of course. But her actions were loud enough to speak for her. She gave him one last look, as if telling him it was time. As if, despite everything, she still had hope that she could get back to her cub. Jack didn't hesitate. He immediately rose to his feet, his survival instincts kicking in. The cub needed its mother. And if there was a chance, even a sliver of one, to reunite them, he wasn't going to let it slip away. With all the energy left in his body, Jack mounted the snowmobile and motioned for the mother bear to follow. The ride back was no less difficult than the journey had been before. The wind bit harder, the snow thicker, but now, there was a fire of purpose driving Jack forward. He pushed the snowmobile as fast as he dared, his heart pounding as the miles seemed to stretch out forever. The mother bear trailed behind him, her movements slower now, her head down against the cold wind. She was exhausted, but she was determined. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, until finally, Jack saw the small, familiar outline of the cabin. His pulse quickened. His stomach twisted. The cub. When he reached the cabin, Jack didn't waste a second. He jumped off the snowmobile and rushed inside, his breath quick and shallow. The cub was still lying on the cot, but its eyes were open now, its tiny body beginning to show the signs of recovery. "Stay strong, little one," Jack muttered under his breath as he carefully scooped up the cub, wrapping it in the thermal blanket. He carried it outside, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. He approached the mother bear slowly, giving her space. Her tired eyes met his, and then she glanced down at the cub in his arms. The moment their eyes locked, mother and child, Jack felt something shift in the air. It was instinct. The mother bear approached, her movements slow but purposeful. The cub, sensing her presence, let out a weak but unmistakable whimper. Jack placed the cub on the ground, just a few feet away from the mother, and stepped back. The moment the cub saw its mother, it crawled toward her with all the strength it could muster, its tiny legs trembling beneath it. The bear lowered her head, nudging the cub gently with her nose. They both froze for a moment, the bond between them undeniable, pure. Then, the cub, exhausted but desperate for its mother, let out a soft growl, its first sound of life in what felt like forever. The mother bear growled back, low and tender. The reunion was complete. Jack stood back, watching in awe as the mother and cub shared a quiet, intimate moment. It was raw, beautiful, survival, love, hope, all intertwined in the stillness of the storm. He felt the weight of the moment in his chest. This was the miracle he had prayed for. But it wasn't over. The mother bear, with the last of her strength, helped her cub rise to its feet. She wasn't fully healed, far from it. But she had her cub. And in that moment, Jack knew that together, they would survive. Jack's eyes watered. He wasn't sure if it was from the wind, the exhaustion, or the overwhelming feeling of relief. He had saved them both. But more importantly, he had witnessed the power of a bond that transcended everything. The world might be falling apart, but in that brief moment, in the heart of the storm, two souls, man and bear, had defied the odds. They had fought together. And they had won. With the cub nestled between them, the mother bear and her cub began to walk toward the vast, snow-covered landscape. Jack watched them go, his heart heavy with emotion. "Goodbye," he whispered, knowing it was the last time he would see them. But deep down, Jack knew the world had just witnessed something that few could ever comprehend. A bond forged in the harshest of conditions, a story of survival, sacrifice, and the kind of love that could not be broken by the storm. As the mother bear and cub disappeared into the wilderness, Jack turned back toward the cabin. The storm would eventually subside, but the memory of that moment, their miracle, would stay with him forever.